In 1932, the collapse did not announce itself. There was no single morning when people woke up and understood that the world they trusted no longer worked. Instead, things slowed first. Deliveries arrived late. Paychecks grew smaller. Conversations became cautious. People spoke as if something fragile hovered just out of sight, something that might shatter if named directly. For Caleb Whitmore, the change was not abstract. It was physical. It was visible in the way men moved through the Texas oil fields, slower, quieter, conserving energy they no longer believed would be replenished. Caleb had been there for several months, long enough to learn the rhythm of the work, long enough to notice when that rhythm broke. The days began before sunrise. A thin gray light crept over the flat land, illuminating rigs that never fully slept. Metal groaned and clanged. Engines coughed themselves awake. By the time the sun rose, heat already pressed down, heavy and unmoving. Caleb worked with his hands, turning valves, hauling equipment, fixing small failures before they became large ones. His body adapted quickly. Muscles hardened, skin toughened. The work itself did not trouble him. What troubled him was what he heard during breaks. Men spoke about banks first, quietly, as if discussing illness. One bank in a nearby town had closed without warning. Another had limited withdrawals. Someone's savings were tied up, though no one seemed to know what that meant in practice. Later, the talk shifted to hours. Shifts shortened, then rotated, then vanished altogether for some crews. Men began counting days instead of weeks. Caleb listened. He noticed that no one spoke about solutions, only movement, where someone might go next, who might know someone somewhere else. The conversations had no center anymore. One afternoon, a man named Thomas sat beside him in the shade of a rig. Thomas was older, shoulders permanently rounded from years of physical labor. He unfolded a letter slowly, read it twice, then folded it again with care. He did not curse. He did not sigh. He simply sat still for a long time. Later, Caleb learned the letter was a foreclosure notice. That night, in the barracks, Caleb lay awake long after the lights were out. The building vibrated faintly from machinery still running outside. Wind dragged dust against the walls. The smell of oil lingered in everything. He thought about how easily stability dissolved. Not dramatically, not with explosions or shouting, just with absence, a missing paycheck, a closed door, a letter written in careful language that left no room for argument. Caleb realized something then that would not leave him. Everyone around him depended on systems they did not understand and could not repair. And so did he. Caleb had grown up believing, like most people, that effort created security. Work hard, plan carefully, and life would remain predictable. Education reinforced that belief. The more he learned, the more he assumed control followed naturally. But standing in the oil fields, watching capable men lose everything despite doing exactly what they were told, that belief began to fracture. He began asking himself questions he had never needed to ask before. If the stores closed, how long could he eat? If transportation stopped, where would he go? If money lost its meaning, what remained? The answers were unsettling. He knew languages, he knew theory, he knew history, but he did not know how to live without infrastructure. He could analyze the collapse of civilizations, but not how to preserve food through winter. He could quote philosophers on independence, but not sew clothing that would last years of hard use. Specialization, he realized, was not strength in a failing system. It was exposure. The idea of leaving did not arrive fully formed. It crept in slowly, tested itself against reason, then returned stronger each time. What if he stepped away from the system entirely, not temporarily, not as protest, but as an experiment? What if he removed himself so completely that failure elsewhere could not reach him? The thought felt dangerous, not because it was unrealistic, but because it was plausible. Caleb began to read maps at night, not city maps or road maps, but topographical maps. He studied elevation lines, river paths, blank spaces where names disappeared. One region kept drawing his attention, a deep cut in the earth along the Idaho-Oregon border, a canyon so steep roads never crossed it, a river so violent explorers once turned back rather than follow it. Hell's Canyon. The name alone suggested refusal. Caleb read everything he could find about it, which was almost nothing. That absence itself was telling. Places that did not appear in books often existed beyond easy reach. To Caleb, that was the point. He did not announce his departure. There was nothing to explain. Words would only invite arguments he did not want to win. He sold what he owned, gave away what could not be carried, packed books carefully, choosing those that taught processes rather than ideas alone. He kept tools that could be repaired, clothing that could be layered. When he finished, he had $1 left. That fact did not alarm him. It clarified things. Money had already failed him. He was not afraid to let it go. The journey north took weeks. Trains when possible, hitching rides when necessary, walking long distances through towns that felt half abandoned, shops closed, windows boarded, signs faded. Autumn followed him steadily. Leaves yellowed, then fell. Nights grew colder. The land hardened. By the time he reached Idaho, the air had changed. It smelled sharper. Pine and stone replaced dust and oil. The descent into Hell's Canyon was immediate and unforgiving. Trails narrowed. Switchbacks dropped steeply. Each step downward made the climb back feel more theoretical. Caleb carried everything himself. The weight pressed into his shoulders. His legs shook by the time he reached the canyon floor. When he finally stood beside the river, the scale of the place settled over him. The canyon walls rose thousands of feet above, cutting off the sky early. Sound echoed strangely. The river was everywhere and nowhere at once, its voice changing as it moved. There were no roads, no wires, no signs, just stone, water, and silence. Caleb understood then that leaving would not be easy. That understanding did not frighten him. He chose a site near a bend in the river, where the land widened slightly. The ground was uneven. Rocks protruded everywhere. But it was above the flood line, and sunlight reached it for several hours each day. That was enough. The first shelter was crude by necessity. Caleb dug into the hillside, carving out a shallow cavity. He stacked logs across the opening and layered brush and soil on top. It leaked. It tilted. It barely qualified as protection. Winter arrived early. Cold in Hell's Canyon behaved differently than cold elsewhere. It did not move. It settled. Night after night, temperatures dropped and stayed there. Frost did not melt in shaded areas for weeks. Caleb learned quickly that fire was life. He rationed wood carefully at first, then less carefully as necessity overrode planning. Sagebrush burned fast and demanded attention. Nights fractured into cycles of sleep and waking, wake, feed the fire, lie down fully clothed, sleep lightly, wake again. Food became scarce. Traps worked inconsistently. Fishing was dangerous in icy water. Hunger was not dramatic. It was dull and constant. Days lost names. They became sequences of tasks. Morning light meant movement. Midday meant gathering. Dark meant endurance. Several times Caleb considered leaving, not with panic, with logic. He could climb out. He could reach towns. He could explain this as preparation, as curiosity. But each time, the same thought followed. Leaving would mean he still depended on escape, and dependence was what he had come here to face. By midwinter, his body had changed. Weight fell away, hands cracked, fingers stiffened with cold. Some sensation never fully returned. The cold lasted 47 days without lifting. During that time, Caleb learned what books could not teach. He learned the weight of repetition, the strain of doing necessary work without reward, the discipline required when motivation meant nothing. When spring finally arrived, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like permission. Ice loosened, the river moved, green returned slowly, stubbornly. Caleb stood outside his shelter in the warming air and assessed what he had built. It was not enough. He had survived, but survival was not a system. He understood now that if he stayed, and he would, everything would need to change. He would need real shelter, real tools, real skills. This place would not forgive mistakes twice. Standing there at the bottom of Hell's Canyon, Caleb Whitmore made a quiet decision. He would not leave, but he would never endure another winter unprepared. The first real work began after the snow receded. Caleb did not rush. The winter had taught him that haste was a luxury reserved for people with backup options. Here, mistakes accumulated quietly until they became irreversible. Each morning began the same way. He woke when light reached the edge of the canyon wall and spilled downward in a slow gradient. The river changed color with the light, shifting from iron gray to dull green. Cold lingered even as spring advanced, clinging to the ground in shaded pockets. Caleb ate sparingly. What little food remained from winter was treated with care. Hunger was no longer alarming, it was familiar. What mattered now was energy, how to spend it, when to conserve it, and when to push past fatigue. He began by clearing stone. The ground where he stood was not soil in any useful sense. It was a layered accumulation of rock fragments, compacted over centuries by gravity and runoff. Digging revealed more stone, always more stone. He moved each piece by hand. There were no shortcuts. Larger rocks required leverage. Smaller ones accumulated slowly, almost mockingly, as if the land were testing his patience rather than his strength. By midday, his hands burned. By afternoon, they shook. He stopped when shaking began. That rule alone kept him alive. Caleb marked the area where he intended to build something permanent. Not a shelter dug into the earth, but a structure that could hold heat, resist fire, and endure decades of weather. He did not yet know exactly what it would look like, only that it could not rely on luck. In the evenings, he sat near the river and read, not for escape, but for alignment. He revisited texts on early settlements, on stone construction, on metallurgy. He read slowly, translating ideas into action in his mind. The canyon quieted at night. Wind moved high above him along the rim, but rarely reached the bottom. Darkness arrived early and stayed. Without artificial light, time stretched. He slept deeply now, exhaustion earned rather than forced. Days passed in this pattern. Move stone, observe light, read, sleep. Gradually, a sense of order returned, not comfort, but predictability. That alone felt like progress. One afternoon, while hauling a particularly stubborn slab of rock, Caleb lost his footing. The stone slipped. His knee struck hard against another rock, sending a sharp pulse up his leg. He sat still for a long time afterward. Pain was information. Panic was noise. He let the first speak and ignored the second. The knee swelled slightly but remained stable. He adjusted his movements for the rest of the day. That evening, he built a simple brace from cloth and leather. The incident reinforced something the winter had already taught him. In isolation, injury was not an inconvenience. It was a negotiation with reality. From that day forward, Caleb worked differently. He planned each task backward, asking not how quickly it could be done, but how safely. He broke labor into smaller segments. He rested deliberately, even when momentum tempted him to continue. Progress slowed, but it also became sustainable. Spring matured into early summer. The canyon transformed gradually. Green thickened along the riverbanks. Insects returned. Birds nested in crevices high above. The river swelled with snowmelt, its voice louder and more insistent. Caleb adjusted his routines to the heat. Work shifted earlier. Mornings were for heavy labor, afternoons for lighter tasks, repair, and planning. He began stockpiling stone near the marked site, not stacking randomly, but sorting by size and shape. Flat stones were set aside, long stones grouped together. Pieces that locked naturally were kept close. This process took days. It felt unproductive at first, but gradually patterns emerged. The stones suggested their own structure. Caleb trusted that instinct. In the evenings, he practiced small skills, knots, simple joinery, tool repair. He sharpened blades until they cut cleanly and consistently. Dull tools wasted energy. Energy was currency here. He also began testing soil. Small plots near the river were cleared and turned. The soil was poor, rocky and thin, but it responded slightly when organic matter was mixed in. Fish remains from the river were buried. Plant waste composted slowly. Nothing grew yet, but Caleb was patient. Summer in Hell's Canyon was a different kind of trial. Heat pressed down relentlessly. The canyon floor trapped it, reflecting it back from stone and water alike. Midday temperatures soared. Sweat evaporated almost instantly, leaving salt behind. Caleb learned to read his body carefully. Dehydration came quietly. He forced himself to drink regularly, even when thirst dulled. Work continued. Stone by stone, the foundation began to take shape. There was no ceremony when the first course was laid, just placement, adjustment, correction. He worked alone, speaking rarely even to himself. Words felt unnecessary. The rhythm of labor filled the space where conversation might have been. At night, exhaustion arrived honestly. He slept deeply, dreamless, waking stiff but functional. Time passed, not in weeks or months, but in visible accumulation. A cleared area, a line of stone, a pile of sorted material. This was how permanence began. By late summer, Caleb understood something fundamental. He was no longer testing whether he could live here. He was committing. That realization did not arrive as excitement. It arrived as responsibility. If he stayed, and he was staying, then every choice from this point forward carried weight beyond the moment. There would be no resets. That knowledge sharpened his focus. He reviewed his tools carefully. Some would not last another year. Handles cracked. Edges wore thin. Repairs were possible, but replacements were not. He needed the ability to shape metal. The thought had been present since winter, but now it became unavoidable. Without metalwork, he would always depend on salvaged tools. Dependence, even delayed, was still dependence. The idea of building a forge felt ambitious, almost reckless, but so had everything else. Caleb began collecting materials quietly: clay-rich soil for insulation, flat stones for a firebox. He sketched designs in the dirt, erased them, drew again. There was no rush. Autumn would come soon enough. As summer faded, the canyon changed again. Heat softened. Shadows lengthened. The river dropped, exposing new banks. Caleb harvested what little he could from the experimental plots. The yield was small, barely worth mentioning, but it was proof. Life could take hold here if treated carefully. He dried what he could, stored it against rodents. Every ounce mattered. Work intensified as the first cold nights returned. Firewood was cut and stacked deliberately this time, more than he thought he needed, then more. He improved the shelter incrementally, reinforced weak points, redirected smoke, reduced drafts. It was still temporary, but it would not betray him as easily. By the time the first snow returned, Caleb was exhausted, but prepared. Not confident, prepared. The second winter arrived without drama. Cold settled again, familiar, but no less dangerous. But this time, firewood held. Food lasted longer. Sleep stabilized. Caleb still woke at night, but less often. He no longer feared silence. Days continued, hard but survivable. In the long nights, he planned. He reviewed every failure of the first winter and translated it into requirements: thicker walls, controlled heat, better tools, stored food, redundancy. By the time spring returned for the second time, Caleb was no longer measuring survival in days. He was measuring it in years. Standing once again in the warming air, he looked at the foundation stones, the sorted piles, the cleared ground. This time, the decision did not need words. He was no longer a visitor in Hell's Canyon. He was a resident, and the real work was about to begin. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept downward from the rim of the canyon day by day, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. Snow lingered in shaded folds long after sunlight returned to the valley floor. Meltwater threaded itself into the ground, loosening stone, exposing roots that had survived another winter by waiting. Caleb moved carefully now. The second winter had left its mark, not dramatically, but permanently. His hands were stronger, yes, but also stiffer. Cold had a way of settling into joints and refusing to leave. He accepted it without resentment. This was not a body meant for comfort. It was a body meant for work. Each morning began with inspection: firewood stack, roof line, stored food, tools. Nothing could be assumed. Survival was not a state. It was a condition that required maintenance. The shelter still held. Smoke drew cleanly. No signs of rot yet. Rodents had been kept at bay with simple traps and vigilance. These were small victories, but they accumulated. Caleb stepped outside and stood still for several minutes every morning, letting his eyes adjust to the light, letting his mind catch up with his body. The river had resumed its steady voice, louder now with meltwater. Birds returned in stages, first the distant ones, then the bold. Life always came back. That fact never stopped surprising him. He returned to the foundation stones with renewed clarity. The first year had been about learning what not to do. The second winter confirmed what could not be tolerated. Now, the task ahead was not speculative, it was defined. He began laying stone again. This time, every movement carried intention, shaped by experience. He tested each stone for balance before placing it. He learned to read how weight traveled downward, how pressure distributed itself across irregular shapes. Walls were not stacks. They were systems. Stone remembered gravity. He worked slowly, sometimes setting only a few stones in an entire morning. When one did not sit correctly, he removed it without argument. There was no pride in forcing a mistake to remain. Afternoons were reserved for gathering. Clay soil was hauled from upstream in small loads. Caleb tested it with water, kneading it until he understood its composition. Too sandy, and it cracked. Too wet, and it sagged. He adjusted, mixed, tested again. The land taught only one way, through repetition. As days lengthened, Caleb's routines became more defined. Morning, heavy labor. Midday, rest, hydration, light tasks. Afternoon, preparation, planning, repair. Evening, reading, sharpening, quiet. There was no clock. The sun determined everything. He noticed that his thoughts changed with the rhythm. Inactivity bred doubt. Work clarified it. Philosophy came not from sitting and wondering, but from doing and observing consequences. When he paused long enough to think abstractly, the same conclusion always returned. Modern life separated action from outcome. Here, the connection was immediate. Mistakes were felt directly. Success, too. That clarity was addictive. The forge came next, not as a structure, but as an idea. Caleb spent weeks doing nothing but thinking through the process. He read, he visualized, he practiced movements with empty hands. Fire behavior mattered, airflow mattered, heat distribution mattered. Failure here would not be theoretical. Molten metal did not forgive ignorance. He marked a site slightly away from the shelter, downwind. Fire and living space would never share walls. That lesson was old, older than books. Stone for the forge was chosen carefully. Some rock fractured when heated, others held. He tested samples with small fires, observing cracks, listening for the dull sound of stress. Pieces that failed were discarded without hesitation. Again, the canyon instructed. By early summer, the foundation walls rose high enough to suggest form. Caleb stepped back often, viewing them from different angles. He imagined cold pressing inward, heat pushing outward. He imagined decades of freeze and thaw testing every joint. If the structure failed, it would not be from lack of effort. It would be from lack of understanding. That awareness kept him cautious. He reinforced corners, added mass where wind would strike hardest, left openings narrow, purposeful. Light was less important than warmth. Beauty, if it came, would come from function. The first tool he made entirely himself was crude. A simple wedge, hammered from scavenged metal, uneven and imperfect. But it held. It split wood better than stone ever could. Caleb turned it over in his hands for a long time. This was not pride. It was acknowledgement. He had crossed another threshold. From that moment forward, progress accelerated, not because he rushed, but because each new capability multiplied the next. Metal enabled better tools. Better tools enabled better construction. Better construction preserved energy. Preserved energy allowed learning. This was not survival anymore. It was development. Summer deepened. Heat returned, but it no longer felt hostile. Caleb had adapted his movements, his expectations. Shade was respected. Water was sacred. He began improving his food systems again. Larger plots, better composting, more deliberate placement. Plants responded slowly, but they responded. At night, exhaustion was deep but clean. Sleep arrived without resistance. Sometimes he dreamed of the oil fields he had left behind, not with longing, but with distance. The noise, the shouting, the relentless urgency. Waking from those dreams felt like relief. Here, nothing demanded haste. only consistency. As autumn approached for the second time since his arrival, Caleb stood inside the rising stone walls and listened. Wind passed overhead. The river continued below. For the first time, the space felt enclosed, not trapped, but held. He imagined fire burning here, heat contained, tools hung along the walls, a place not just to survive winter, but to work through it. That thought stayed with him. Winter would come again. It always did. But this time, it would meet something prepared. The first snow of the third winter arrived quietly. There was no storm this time, no announcement. Just a soft whitening of the stone at dawn. A thin layer resting on the foundation walls and the stacked firewood like a held breath. Caleb stood outside longer than he needed to. Cold had returned, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt familiar, an old pressure he understood how to meet. He had learned its patterns, its patience, its refusal to be negotiated with. The walls held their shape. The shelter remained sound. Smoke rose steadily into the still air. Nothing had gone wrong overnight. That alone was worth noticing. He stepped inside and set the day in motion the way he always did, without ceremony. Fire first, then water, then food. Each action precise, practiced, unremarkable. Winter work would be quieter now, less hauling, more shaping, more thinking. Metal waited, stone waited, ideas waited. Outside, the canyon settled into its long silence, sound dampened by snow, movement slowed everywhere except the river, which continued on unchanged. Caleb sat near the fire and opened a book, but did not read immediately. He listened instead to the crack of burning wood, to the subtle shift of heat against stone, to the absence of anything demanding his attention. This was the difference he had been building toward, though he had not known it at the beginning. Not comfort, not ease, stability, a life that could endure its own repetition. He did not measure how far he had come. There was no scale for that. He only knew that the next season would arrive whether he was ready or not, and this time he would meet it standing. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire burned steadily. The canyon waited, and so did he. Color drained slowly from the canyon walls. Greens dulled, yellows deepened, then browned. The river narrowed as snowmelt faded, exposing gravel bars that had been submerged for months. Days shortened, but not abruptly. Light receding a little more each evening, like a tide pulling back. Caleb adjusted without thinking about it. He always did. Summer work tapered into consolidation. Nothing new was started unless it could be finished before cold returned in earnest. Projects were evaluated not by ambition, but by risk. Anything that might leave him half prepared was postponed. The forge, however, demanded continued attention. Fire did not respect seasons. Refinement. Metalwork changed once the basics were mastered. Early forging had been about learning how not to fail catastrophically. Now it became about consistency, heat control, repetition, predictable outcomes. Caleb learned to recognize temperature by color alone: dull red, cherry, orange. He no longer needed to guess. His hands moved with confidence, shaped by hundreds of cycles of heat and strike. He began remaking his earliest tools. The first punch was replaced with a better one, straighter, harder, more durable. The wedge was refined, edges improved, balance corrected. This was not waste. This was evolution. Each improved tool retired its predecessor quietly. Nothing ceremonial. Old versions were set aside, still useful in limited ways, but no longer primary. Progress did not erase the past. It built on it. The rhythm of solitude. By now, Caleb could go days without forming a complete sentence aloud. Thought flowed without language. Planning happened spatially, visually. Problems were rotated in the mind like stones in the hand, tested from different angles until a solution presented itself. Solitude had ceased to feel empty. It felt structured. He understood that many people feared being alone because silence revealed unfinished thoughts. Here, those thoughts were unavoidable, but also manageable. There was no distraction to dilute them, but also no pressure to resolve them quickly. Time did that. The question of firearms. The idea arrived quietly, as most significant ones did. Caleb had never framed it as desire. It emerged instead as necessity. Hunting with traps and simple tools worked, but not reliably. Distance mattered. Precision mattered. Winter scarcity amplified small inefficiencies into real danger. He had read about gunsmithing long before arriving here, understood the theory, respected the difficulty. Now, standing beside a forge that obeyed him, surrounded by tools he had shaped from nothing, the idea no longer felt impossible. It felt inevitable. But inevitability did not imply haste. He began by studying barrels, not making them, not yet, but understanding them. He reread technical texts, translating words into motion in his mind. Boring, rifling, tolerances. This was not knife work. This was precision stretched across length. Mistakes here did not dull an edge. They destroyed months of labor. Caleb waited. Winter returns again. The third winter announced itself more firmly than the last. Snow fell heavier earlier, wind cut lower into the canyon, temperatures dropped sharply at night. Caleb had expected this. Firewood was abundant, food stores sufficient. The building held heat better now, stone absorbing and releasing warmth slowly. He noticed something new this winter. Stillness no longer frightened him. Long nights were not something to be endured. They were something to inhabit. He spent hours at the forge, even when there was no immediate need, practicing control, bringing metal just to the edge of workable heat, then letting it cool, learning restraint. The forge became less a place of output and more a place of calibration. Building the system. By midwinter, Caleb understood something that would have been difficult to explain aloud. No single skill mattered. What mattered was integration. The forge existed because the shelter preserved heat. The shelter existed because stone and tools allowed precision. The tools existed because fire was controlled. Fire was controlled because fuel was prepared. Fuel was prepared because the body was fed. Nothing stood alone. Failure in one area echoed everywhere. This realization did not cause anxiety. It caused focus. He stopped thinking in terms of tasks and started thinking in terms of flow. Energy in, energy out, loss minimized. That was the real work. The first barrel attempt, preparation only. Caleb did not attempt a rifle barrel in winter. He prepared for it. He selected steel carefully, dense, uniform, free of visible flaws. He tested small sections under heat and pressure. He discarded anything that behaved unpredictably. Tools were prepared months in advance. A boring jig was designed and redesigned repeatedly. He built mock versions from wood, testing alignment. Any deviation greater than what he could correct was unacceptable. He did not rush this. The barrel would come later. Patience here was not virtue, it was survival. Spring, again. When spring returned for the third time, it felt less like a surprise and more like confirmation. The canyon woke, as it always did. Water moved, green returned, birds nested. The cycle continued without regard for his presence. Caleb stood at the edge of his work and observed. not with pride, but with assessment. The building was solid now, the forge dependable, tools abundant, food system stable, if still demanding. He had crossed another threshold, not from survival to comfort, but from improvisation to intention. The mind changes shape. Isolation had altered him, not dramatically, not in ways that would show immediately, but his relationship with effort had changed, with time, with need. He no longer thought in terms of what he wanted. He thought in terms of what was required. Desire introduced noise. Requirement clarified. This did not make life smaller. It made it quieter. Closing movement of Part 2. By early summer, the pieces were in place, not complete, but aligned. Caleb stood beside the forge at dusk, watching heat fade from worked steel. The air smelled of cooling metal and dust. The river murmured below, unchanged. Soon he would begin the barrel. Not tomorrow, not this week, but soon. And when he did, it would not be an experiment. It would be a continuation. The day Caleb finally began cutting the steel, there was nothing remarkable about the weather. The sky was clear but pale. The river ran low and steady. Heat lingered in the canyon but no longer pressed. It was an ordinary day, and that was exactly why he chose it. He did not speak aloud. He laid out his tools carefully, each one placed where his hands expected it to be. The jig sat level, checked and rechecked. The steel bar rested in position, clamped securely, its length unassuming, its surface unmarked. Months of preparation had reduced this moment to a sequence of motions. That was the point. The first turn of the boring handle required little effort. Resistance was light, almost deceptive. A thin curl of metal emerged, dull and lifeless, falling away without sound. Caleb stopped immediately. He examined the cut, measured alignment, checked tension. Then he continued. Minutes passed, then an hour, then more. Movement was slow, repetitive, and exacting. The tool advanced only fractions at a time. Withdraw, clear, inspect, advance again. There was no rhythm to lose himself in, no momentum to carry him forward, only attention. By late afternoon, he had removed less material than a modern machine would discard in seconds, but the bore was straight, centered, clean. Caleb set the tool aside and covered the steel. That was enough for one day. Evening settled gently into the canyon. Light slid off the stone walls. The river darkened. Caleb sat outside his shelter and let the day drain from him. His hands ached, not sharply, but deeply, the kind of ache that came from restraint rather than exertion. He understood now what this next phase would demand. Not strength, not endurance. Consistency without deviation. Weeks would pass with little visible progress. Entire days would yield only inches. Mistakes would erase time, not minutes. This work would test something different. Patience layered on patience. He rose, tended the fire, and prepared for sleep. There was no sense of anticipation, no excitement, just readiness. The forge would wait. The steel would wait. The canyon would wait. Everything here moved at the speed required. Caleb lay down as night settled fully, the sound of the river steady and unchanged. Tomorrow he would return to the same motion, and the next day, and the next. That was how this would be done. The second day of boring began exactly like the first. Caleb woke before light, not because he intended to, but because his body had learned the shape of the work ahead. There was no anxiety in the waking, just readiness, the quiet alertness that came when effort had direction. He ate, he drank, he warmed his hands slowly near the fire. Then he went to the forge. The steel waited where he had left it, covered against dust, unchanged. Caleb uncovered it carefully, as if movement alone might disturb the alignment. He checked the jig again. Nothing had shifted. That mattered more than progress. The handle turned. Withdraw, clear, inspect, advance. The motion was meditative in the way walking a long distance could be meditative, not because it emptied the mind, but because it focused it so completely that nothing else intruded. Each curl of metal told him something: thickness, color, resistance, the sound it made when it fell against stone. He adjusted pressure by instinct now, responding to signals that would have been invisible a year earlier. This was not learning anymore. This was application. By mid-morning, his shoulders burned, not from force, but from holding precision for too long. He stopped without argument. Stopping early was part of the work. He stretched, he walked, he drank, then returned. Inches, not milestones. Progress was measured in inches, sometimes less. Caleb resisted the urge to measure depth too often. Measurement tempted expectation. Expectation bred impatience. Impatience ruined work like this. Instead, he measured alignment. Straightness mattered more than speed. Days passed. Some days ended with satisfaction. Others ended with quiet frustration. Moments where resistance changed subtly, where the cut felt wrong enough to stop, but not wrong enough to explain. On those days, he stopped earlier. The steel did not care how much he wanted to continue. The mental toll. After a week, Caleb noticed the change. His dreams shifted. They became repetitive. Endless turning, endless checking, motions looping without resolution. He woke with his hands clenched, muscles tight as if still working. He adjusted his routine. More time outside the forge, more walking, more work in the garden and on stone, tasks that required strength but less exactness. Balance mattered. A man could break himself not only by effort but by focus, held too long without release. Small failures, quiet corrections. One afternoon, resistance changed abruptly. Caleb felt it immediately, a slight binding, barely perceptible. He stopped mid-turn, heart steady but alert. He withdrew the tool and inspected the bore. There it was, a deviation so small it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. A whisper of unevenness, not catastrophic, but unacceptable. He did not curse. He did not tense. He recalibrated. The next 2 days were spent correcting that single flaw, advancing only where alignment allowed, shaving microns of metal at a time. Those days produced almost nothing visible. They produced correctness. Season moves around him. Summer advanced while Caleb remained fixed to the work. Heat came and went. Shadows shortened, then lengthened again. The river dropped lower, exposing stones he had never seen before. Caleb noticed these changes only in passing. His awareness had narrowed, not dangerously but deliberately. The barrel was a tunnel of attention, and everything else existed at the periphery. Even hunger softened. He ate because routine demanded it, not because appetite called. This was the cost of precision. Weeks become a unit of time. By the time autumn hinted at itself again, Caleb had been boring the same piece of steel for weeks. The bore was long now, clean, true, still incomplete. His hands bore the evidence. Calluses thickened in specific places. His grip adapted. Movements became smaller, more economical. He had learned to sit with slowness, not endure it. Sit with it. The question of continuation. One evening, as light drained from the canyon, Caleb set the tool aside and did not cover the steel immediately. He sat instead, looking at it. There was no doubt now that he could finish it. The question was whether he could finish it correctly. Day after day, without rushing, without faltering, without allowing fatigue to introduce error. This was not about skill. It was about character under repetition. He covered the steel carefully and stood. Tomorrow would answer nothing new. That was acceptable. The work settled into him. After enough days, the motion no longer felt repetitive. It felt structural, like breathing or walking. Caleb stopped counting hours. He stopped marking progress. The barrel existed now as a continuous relationship rather than a task with an end. Each morning, he approached it the same way, not with expectation, with readiness. He learned to read his own condition before touching the tool. If his hands trembled slightly from cold, he waited. If his shoulders carried tension from the previous day, he stretched longer. Precision did not begin with metal. It began with the body. Some mornings, the work advanced smoothly. The tool cut cleanly. Shavings emerged consistent and fine. Those were good days, but not special ones. Other mornings resisted. Metal that had behaved obediently the day before seemed to harden, refusing to give way without argument. On those days, Caleb slowed further. Pressure decreased. Heat was adjusted. The pace became almost ceremonial. He never forced the cut. Force was the enemy of alignment. Learning to stop. One of the hardest lessons was learning when to stop. Not at the end of the day, not when exhausted, but in the middle of a motion that could continue. Caleb learned to recognize the moment when attention began to thin, not dramatically, not as distraction, but as subtle impatience, a slight urge to just finish this pass, a quiet desire for visible progress. Those moments were dangerous. He learned to stop precisely there. At first, this restraint felt unnatural. He had been raised, like most men, to associate endurance with virtue, to push through fatigue, to finish what had been started. Here, finishing incorrectly erased everything. So he unlearned that reflex. Stopping became part of the discipline, the forge as companion. The forge no longer felt like a place of effort. It felt like a presence. Fire responded to him now with minimal adjustment. Airflow, fuel, and heat aligned without conscious calculation. The forge mirrored his state. On days when his focus was sharp, the fire behaved predictably. On days when his mind wandered, it demanded correction. This was not mysticism. It was feedback. Caleb understood that all systems behaved this way when observed long enough. They amplified inconsistency. They punished assumption. He respected that. Rifling begins in thought. Though the barrel was not yet bored completely, Caleb began thinking about rifling, not doing it, thinking it. Rifling was not merely cutting grooves, it was imposing order on interior space invisible to the eye. The spiral had to be consistent, the depth incremental, the pitch exact. He sketched mechanisms in the dirt outside the forge, then erased them. He built wooden models, tested their motion, discarded them. He imagined failures before they occurred. This mental work was exhausting in a different way than physical labor. It drained him without leaving soreness. He learned to limit it. Some evenings, he refused to think about rifling at all. He read instead, or walked the canyon floor until darkness rose around him. Balance returned only when effort had boundaries. Time loses texture. As weeks turned into months, Caleb noticed something subtle. Time stopped feeling segmented. There was no clear separation between days. They flowed together, unified by routine rather than novelty. Memory organized itself by progress rather than calendar. He remembered moments by resistance overcome, by alignment corrected, by insight gained. The rest faded. This did not trouble him. He understood that time was not meant to be collected. It was meant to be used. Small intrusions. Occasionally, the outside world intruded. A distant boat on the river. Voices echoing faintly from far downstream. A flash of color where someone passed briefly through the canyon. Caleb acknowledged these intrusions without reaction. They belonged to another rhythm. He did not hide. He did not engage. They passed. The canyon absorbed them quickly. The bore nears completion. One afternoon, the tool reached a depth that changed the feel of the work entirely. The resistance softened, not from weakness, but from completion approaching. The bore now extended deep enough that withdrawal took noticeable time. Shavings lengthened. Sound changed. Caleb slowed further. The final portion would be the most dangerous. Alignment errors here could not be corrected later. The barrel had become a long, narrow truth, any deviation magnified by distance. He shortened his work sessions, sometimes advancing only minutes before stopping. Frustration never surfaced. This was expected. Rest as technique. Caleb began scheduling rest deliberately, entire days without touching the barrel. On those days, he worked stone. He tended the garden. He repaired tools. He let his hands do different work. His mind occupied different spaces. These days were not breaks. They were part of the process. When he returned to the barrel, his perception sharpened. Subtle cues reappeared. The work resumed cleanly. He learned that mastery did not come from persistence alone. It came from rhythm. The bore completes. The day the bore reached its final depth arrived without announcement. Caleb felt it before he measured it. The tool moved differently. Resistance equalized along the entire length. The steel responded uniformly. He withdrew the tool and inspected the bore carefully, light angled just right. It was straight, clean, true. He did nothing else that day. He covered the barrel and walked along the river until dusk. He let his body settle, let the significance arrive without forcing it. The hardest part of the work was complete, but the most delicate still remained. Rifling begins. Rifling did not start with cutting. It started with restraint. Caleb built the rifling jig slowly, testing each component repeatedly. The cutter was adjusted to remove almost nothing. Depth would be built gradually, pass by pass. The first cut was nearly invisible. That was intentional. He completed one pass and stopped. The spiral was set. From here on, everything depended on consistency. He understood that this phase would take longer than boring, that weeks might pass with no visible change, that attention would be tested in new ways. He accepted this. The work had already shaped him into someone capable of it. The weight of continuation. By the time autumn returned once more, the barrel rested inside the shelter, partially rifled, waiting patiently. Caleb stood over it one evening, hands resting lightly on the bench. There was no doubt left now. He would finish this, not because he wanted to, because he could, and because he would not allow half measures into a life built entirely on consequence. Outside, the canyon prepared for winter again. Inside, the spiral waited. The final rifling pass did not feel different from the others. That surprised Caleb. There was no surge of satisfaction, no sense of arrival. The tool advanced, withdrew, cleared, just as it had dozens of times before. The spiral deepened by an amount too small to see without looking for it. When the pass was complete, He set the cutter aside and waited. He did not rush to inspect the barrel. Inspection demanded patience equal to construction. He let the steel cool completely, then cleaned it slowly, carefully, removing every trace of oil and debris. Only then did he hold it to the light. The interior caught the reflection cleanly. The grooves were even, consistent from end to end. No chatter, no deviation, no visible flaws. Caleb lowered the barrel and rested it on the bench. He felt no urge to test it immediately. That would come later. Today was not about proof. It was about recognition. The work was finished. Outside, the canyon had already begun its quiet shift toward winter. Nights grew longer. The river dropped lower, exposing stone polished smooth by years of movement. Wind traveled higher now, rarely reaching the floor. Caleb adjusted his routines accordingly. He cleaned and stored tools not in haste, but with care. Each was inspected, sharpened, repaired where necessary. The forge was banked lower, fires kept smaller, more deliberate. The building held warmth well now. Stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Smoke drew cleanly. No drafts betrayed weak points. Nothing felt provisional anymore. That realization did not produce comfort. It produced calm. In the evenings, Caleb sat near the fire with the barrel nearby, not to admire it, but to let its presence settle into the space. It was not a symbol. It was a consequence. Months of discipline had condensed into a single object. He understood that what followed would matter more than what had already been done. Assembly, testing, use. Those would introduce risk again. That was unavoidable. But the foundation was sound. He slept deeply during those nights, not from exhaustion, but from alignment. Body, tools, shelter, and season all agreed. Winter would come again. This time, it would arrive to meet a man who could shape steel to his will, not quickly, not easily, but correctly. The canyon did not respond. It never did. But it did not resist him either. The assembly began in silence. Caleb laid the finished barrel on the workbench and did nothing else for a long time. He did not touch it immediately. He did not rush to the next step. He allowed the object to exist as it was, complete in one sense, incomplete in another. Assembly was not creation. It was alignment. Every piece that followed would depend on decisions already made months earlier. There would be no opportunity to correct fundamental flaws. That phase had passed. He began with the action. The components were simple in appearance but unforgiving in function. Springs were shaped and tempered slowly, heated until they glowed just enough, then quenched with care. Too much heat would make them brittle. Too little would leave them weak. Caleb tested each one repeatedly. Flex, release, flex again. Failure here would not announce itself immediately. It would wait, then appear at the worst possible moment. He refused that uncertainty. The trigger followed. Clean break mattered more than comfort. He filed, tested, adjusted, then walked away and returned the next day to test again. Muscle memory could deceive. Only repetition across time revealed truth. The stock came last. He selected wood not for beauty, but for stability. Grain mattered, density mattered, balance mattered. He shaped it slowly, removing almost nothing at a time, letting the form emerge rather than imposing it. By the time the pieces came together, weeks had passed. The rifle existed, not as a weapon, as a system, testing without drama. The first test shot was not ceremonial. Caleb loaded carefully, measured powder precisely, seated the projectile with deliberate pressure. He stepped away, secured the rifle, and pulled the firing cord from behind cover. The report echoed once through the canyon, sharp and brief. He waited. Nothing failed. He inspected the barrel immediately, then again, then once more after cleaning. No cracks, no distortion, no irregular fouling. The second shot followed, then the third. Only after dozens of shots did he allow himself to shoulder the rifle. Even then, he fired cautiously, attentive to sound, recoil, vibration. The rifle performed exactly as designed. Accuracy followed consistency. Groups tightened gradually as he learned how the rifle wanted to be handled. This was not a contest. It was a conversation. When he was satisfied, he cleaned it thoroughly and stored it. There was no celebration. The work simply moved on. Years without markers. Life resumed its rhythm. Hunting became more efficient, but not careless. Caleb took only what was needed. He wasted nothing. The rifle did not change his ethics. It sharpened his margins. Seasons continued: spring planting, summer labor, autumn preparation, winter refinement. The building weathered storms without complaint. Stone darkened and lightened with rain and sun. Tools wore gradually, predictably. Caleb aged quietly. Strength faded first, then endurance. He adapted. He broke tasks into smaller pieces. He relied more on planning than effort. Where force once solved problems, leverage now did. Visitors arrived occasionally. At first they were rare. River travelers who stopped out of curiosity. They expected a recluse. They found a calm man with clear eyes and deliberate movements. Caleb did not perform for them. He answered questions plainly, offered water, sometimes tea. They stayed longer than planned. Word spread. Attention from the outside. By the time Caleb was in his 60s, the canyon knew his name even if he never used it himself. Writers came, photographers, people who spoke about choices and freedom as if these were abstractions rather than daily obligations. Caleb listened politely. He did not correct them. Most people did not want explanation. They wanted permission. He offered none. Attention changed nothing about his routines, but it introduced a new element: authority. Officials arrived eventually, first curious, then cautious. They spoke of designations, protections, boundaries drawn on maps far away. Caleb listened carefully. When they suggested relocation, he declined. There was no anger, no defiance, only refusal. When they returned later with firmer language, they noticed changes: reinforced stone, a dugout shelter carved deeper into rock, supplies organized with deliberate intent. Caleb did not threaten. He did not need to. The implication was sufficient. The cost of removing him was calculated quietly. An exception was made. Old age arrives. Time did what it always did. Caleb's hand stiffened further. His hearing softened. Vision dimmed at the edges. He adjusted again. He worked fewer hours, read more, walked slowly. Winter became harder, but never unmanageable. Systems carried him when strength could not. He prepared for the end the same way he prepared for everything else. Deliberately, he organized tools, wrote letters, marked notes for those who might come later, not instructions, but context. He did not believe in legacy. He believed in example. The final season. The last spring came gently. Caleb felt its arrival not as renewal, but as closure. He worked when he could, rested when he needed to. There was no urgency left. One morning, he prepared tea and sat beside the river longer than usual. Water moved past him without recognition. The canyon remained unchanged. That felt right. When he lay down that afternoon, he did not struggle. His breath slowed. The body that had carried him through decades of consequence simply stopped. There was no witness. There did not need to be. Afterward, they found him weeks later, as one always does in places like this. Nothing was disturbed. Tools hung where they belonged, the forge cold but intact, the rifle cleaned and stored. Caleb Whitmore had died where he had lived, on his own terms, without negotiation. The canyon absorbed him quietly. Visitors still come now. They walk the stone floors, touch the walls, look at the tools, and imagine a simpler life. They rarely imagine the discipline, but the work remains. And for those who understand what they are seeing, that is enough. The canyon did not change after Caleb Whitmore's death. That was the first thing people noticed, though few said it aloud. They expected some sign: decay, abandonment, collapse. Instead, the place remained ordered. Stone walls held their lines, paths stayed clear. The forge stood intact, dark but unbroken. The systems he had built did not depend on his presence anymore. That, more than anything else, marked the measure of his life. The first visitors after, the first people to arrive after his death, did so by accident. A river guide stopped at the bend near the homestead, intending only to rest. He noticed the absence of movement immediately. Smoke did not rise. No sound came from the shelter. The guide waited longer than necessary. When he finally approached, he did so carefully, respectful, without knowing why. Inside, he found order, not the order of tidiness, but of intention. Nothing was staged. Nothing was neglected. The guide left quietly. Word spread slowly, carried by people who understood that some things did not benefit from urgency, objects that outlast hands. In the months that followed, officials cataloged the site. They worked methodically, photographing, measuring, documenting. They handled tools with caution, as if aware that misuse would be noticed even now. What struck them was not the quantity of objects, but their coherence. Every tool had a place. Every place had a purpose. Nothing existed without justification. The rifle drew particular attention, not because it was ornate, but because it was exact. Experts recognized the work immediately. Hand-bored, hand-rifled, perfectly balanced. It was not art. It was proof. Misunderstandings multiply. As more people learned of Caleb's life, interpretations followed. Some called him a hermit. Others called him a rebel. A few called him a philosopher. None of these were entirely wrong. None were sufficient. Most people wanted the story to support something they already believed. Freedom, escape, protest, simplicity. They missed the harder truth. Caleb had not simplified life. He had accepted its full cost. The silence he left behind. Those who stayed longest at the site noticed something else. The silence felt different there, not empty, not oppressive, structured. It was the kind of silence that existed where nothing demanded attention unnecessarily, where effort had been distilled down to essentials. People spoke more quietly without realizing it. They moved more slowly. They paused more often. The place trained behavior even after its maker was gone. Time continues its work. Years passed. Weather tested the structures. Stone shifted slightly, then settled. Wood aged. Metal darkened. But nothing failed suddenly. The homestead aged the way all well-made things age, predictably, honestly. Maintenance was required. When it was done, it followed the same principles Caleb had lived by. Minimal intervention, maximum respect for function. No improvements were made. There was nothing to improve. What remains? Eventually, the story lost its edges. Details blurred, dates softened. Names mattered less than actions. Caleb Whitmore became a reference point rather than a person, and yet his life continued to ask a question that refused to fade. How much of what we depend on do we actually understand? How much of our safety is borrowed? How much of our time is traded away without noticing? The canyon did not answer these questions. It never had. It simply stood, offering evidence without commentary, the long view. From above, the homestead looked small. From the river, it looked deliberate. From inside, it felt inevitable. They began to come at different times of year. Some arrived in spring when the river ran high and loud, carrying meltwater from places no one could see. Others came in late summer, when the canyon baked and sound traveled strangely far across stone. A few came in winter, moving carefully, deliberately, knowing that mistakes here were not corrected easily. They did not come all at once, and they did not come for the same reasons. Most of them stood for a long time before touching anything. There was a sense, difficult to explain, that the place still belonged to someone, not in a legal sense, and not in a spiritual one either. It was something quieter than ownership. The systems still worked. The walls still held heat. The paths still led where they were meant to lead. Nothing felt abandoned. People lowered their voices without being asked to. They stepped carefully, not because of danger, but because care seemed appropriate. Even those who had never lived far from towns felt the instinct to slow down. The canyon taught that instinct quickly. Some visitors stayed only an hour. They looked, took photographs, and left with a vague feeling that they had missed something important, but could not name what it was. Others stayed longer. They sat by the river. They traced the edges of tools with their fingers. They stood inside the stone structure and felt how sound behaved there, how warmth lingered. A few returned more than once. Those were the ones who began to understand that the place was not about solitude. It was about continuity. Caleb's life had not been a performance. There were no dramatic gestures preserved here, no declarations carved into stone. What remained were decisions, layered one on top of another, each one answering the same question in a slightly different way. What is necessary? What is sufficient? What can be sustained? Time passed, and the answers did not change. The forge rusted slowly on the surface, but remained solid beneath. The anvil stone bore new marks as caretakers tested it, always gently, always stopping short of alteration. The garden plots softened and hardened with the seasons, sometimes overgrown, sometimes cleared again, but never erased. Even neglect behaved differently here. Things did not fall apart quickly. They waited. Weather moved through the canyon the way it always had. Snow filled the quiet spaces. Heat pressed down in summer. Wind shaped sound and shadow. None of it seemed to hurry. Those who spent enough time there began to feel the difference between a place built to be efficient and one built to endure. Efficiency demanded constant input. Endurance demanded alignment. Caleb had chosen alignment. That choice showed itself in small details, in the way stones met without forcing, in the way doors closed without slamming, in the way tools fit hands without explanation. These were not accidents. They were outcomes of attention sustained over years. Many people who left the canyon carried the wrong lesson. They spoke of escape, of rejection, of a man who turned his back on the world. The canyon said nothing to correct them. Others carried something heavier, something less comfortable. They returned to their lives and noticed how much of what surrounded them depended on fragile chains they had never examined. How little they understood about the systems that fed them, warmed them, protected them. How quickly discomfort made them impatient. Those people rarely spoke about the canyon at all. They did not need to. Years continued to accumulate, as they always do. The story shifted shape as it passed from one person to another. Dates were misplaced, scene events compressed or expanded. Some things were exaggerated, others disappeared entirely, but the core remained intact. One person in one place had refused to separate responsibility from dependence. That refusal had required no audience. It had not needed approval. It had only required time, attention, and the willingness to accept consequences without complaint. The canyon remained because it always had. The homestead remained because it had been built to. And somewhere between stone and river, between heat and silence, the work continued to speak for itself, long after the hands that shaped it had gone still. In the evenings, when the light began to slip away from the canyon walls, the river took on a different sound. It no longer rushed. It spoke in a lower register, steady and patient, as if it had settled into itself after a long day of effort. Those who stayed late noticed this first. The change was subtle, but once heard, it was unmistakable. This was the hour Caleb had always preferred. Work slowed naturally at that time, not because it was finished, but because it no longer demanded urgency. Tools were cleaned and set back in their places. Loose soil was patted down. Fires were fed one last time, and then allowed to rest. Nothing was rushed, nothing was left careless. The place remembered that rhythm. Caretakers, years later, found themselves following it without realizing why. They would plan to leave earlier and somehow remain until dusk. They would tell themselves they had one last task, one last check, and then find the sky already darkening above the ridge. There was no discomfort in staying late. The canyon did not punish stillness. Winter revealed the structure's intelligence more clearly than any other season. Snow collected where it was expected and slid away where it was not. The stone held warmth without trapping moisture. The angles of the roof shed weight slowly, deliberately. Even after years without constant attention, the building behaved as though it remembered how it was meant to function. This was not preservation, it was cooperation. People who had grown used to replacing things instead of understanding them often stood inside the lodge and felt a quiet unease. The walls did not explain themselves. They simply existed, firm and unyielding, offering shelter without commentary. Nothing here asked to be admired. The tools told the same story. They bore wear in the places where hands naturally rested. The balance of weight was not symmetrical, but appropriate. Every hammer, every blade, every handle revealed small adjustments made over time, corrections that only come from use rather than design. There was no perfection here, only refinement. Some evenings, the caretaker sat near the forge and imagined the sound it once made when it was alive with heat. They did not try to recreate it. They understood instinctively that reenactment would be disrespectful. The forge had earned its silence. Instead, they listened to the wind pass through the open spaces, carrying the smell of stone and water. They noticed how the canyon did not echo emptiness. It echoed continuity. The idea that a place could teach without speaking unsettled many visitors. They were accustomed to instruction being explicit, signs, labels, explanations. Here, learning happened slowly, and often after departure, Months later, back in cities and towns, people remembered how tired they had been after doing very little, how present they had felt without stimulation, how long it took to adjust to the pace of the place, and how reluctant their bodies had been to abandon it. Some tried to replicate what they thought they had witnessed. They bought land. They gathered tools. They spoke confidently about independence. Most returned to their previous lives within a year. The canyon did not judge them. It had never been about imitation. Caleb's life had not been a template. It was a consequence. One decision leading to another, each narrowing options while deepening commitment. There had been no moment where everything was planned, only a willingness to accept that every solution created new responsibilities. Freedom, as he understood it, was not the absence of constraint. It was the acceptance of chosen constraints without resentment. That distinction mattered. It explained why he had never hurried, why he had never complained about the work, why he had spoken of effort as something neutral, neither punishment nor virtue. Work was simply what allowed life to continue on its own terms. In spring, when the river swelled again and the canyon stirred, the land responded predictably. Soil loosened. Plants returned. Birds nested in the same places they always had. The systems resumed without instruction. This predictability was not monotony. It was trust. The caretakers learned to rely on it. They planned less and observed more. They resisted the urge to improve what already functioned. When something failed, they repaired it using the same principles that had built it in the first place. No shortcuts, no substitutions that weakened the whole. Over time, the place began to shape them as it had shaped Caleb, not into replicas, but into participants. They learned to notice the difference between discomfort and harm, between effort and strain, between silence and loneliness. They learned that solitude, when chosen and structured, does not hollow a person out. It sharpens attention. It removes distraction. It reveals the weight of each decision. The canyon did not care who understood this and who did not. It simply remained. Long after the last visitors left each season, after the paths grew quiet again, the stone lodge stood unchanged. Snow fell, rain passed, heat pressed down and lifted away. Nothing dramatic occurred, and that, perhaps, was the final lesson. A life built slowly, deliberately, in alignment with its surroundings, does not announce itself. It does not demand remembrance. It leaves behind evidence rather than explanation. The river continued to move past 5 Mile Bar just as it always had, carrying water from distant mountains toward a destination no one needed to name. And somewhere within that movement, within that steady refusal to rush, the shape of one man's choices remained, not as a story to be retold, but as a presence that asked nothing and endured anyway. In the early hours before dawn, the canyon held its breath. This was not silence exactly, but a kind of suspension. The river still moved, though more softly. Wind rested instead of roaming. Even the stones seemed to wait. Those who had slept nearby learned to recognize this moment, the brief interval when night had not yet released its hold and morning had not begun to insist on itself. Caleb had always been awake at that hour, not because he forced himself to be, but because his body had learned the rhythm of the place. Light, temperature, sound, all of it acted as a clock more accurate than any mechanical measure. He rose without ceremony, dressed without thought, and stepped outside while the canyon was still undecided about what it would become that day. That habit lingered. Caretakers, years later, found themselves waking early without intention. They stepped outside and stood still, uncertain why they felt compelled to witness this quiet threshold between states. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to. The value was in attention. Morning eventually announced itself the way it always had, indirectly. Light slid down the canyon walls instead of dropping. Color returned in stages. The river reclaimed its voice. Birds began their small, precise negotiations with the air. Work followed naturally, not scheduled, not prioritized, simply taken up where it had been left. Each task contained within it the memory of previous hands, previous solutions. Even repairs carried continuity. Nothing was replaced without understanding what had come before. This was how the place resisted erosion, not by fighting change, but by integrating it slowly. Those who spent enough time here learned that endurance was not stubbornness. It was patience applied consistently. It was knowing when to act and when to allow systems to correct themselves. Caleb had learned that lesson early. The canyon did not reward force. It punished it quietly and without apology. Floods ignored effort. Cold disregarded intention. Heat exposed impatience. Survival here was never about dominance. It was about accommodation. That philosophy was embedded everywhere, in the way water was guided rather than contained, in the way walls absorbed temperature instead of defying it, in the way tools evolved incrementally rather than being reinvented. Even the garden followed this principle. Soil was amended slowly. Seeds were selected with restraint. Yield mattered less than reliability. A smaller harvest that returned every year was worth more than abundance that exhausted the land. This was not minimalism. It was continuity thinking. Visitors often misunderstood this too. They expected simplicity and found complexity. They expected isolation and found interdependence, not with people, but with process. Everything depended on everything else, and nothing was optional. That realization unsettled many. Modern life, by contrast, allowed fragmentation. One could fail in one area and compensate elsewhere. Here, imbalance propagated. Carelessness echoed. Shortcuts accumulated consequences. Caleb had accepted that reality without resentment. He did not romanticize difficulty, nor did he seek suffering as proof of virtue. He simply acknowledged that effort was the price of coherence. A life without contradiction required maintenance. That was all. In later years, as his body slowed and the canyon remained unchanged, he adjusted without drama. Tasks took longer. Movements became economical. Strength yielded to leverage. Speed yielded to sequencing. There was no sense of loss in this transition. Capability had never been about youth. It had always been about understanding. And understanding deepened even as physical capacity declined. The place adapted with him. Paths became more worn where he walked more carefully. Tools were modified for grip rather than force. Workspaces shifted slightly, responding to what the body could offer instead of demanding what it could no longer give. This mutual adaptation was not sentimental, it was practical. When he finally stopped moving through the canyon, nothing needed to change. That was the measure of alignment he had achieved. Systems continued, structures held, processes repeated themselves without interruption. Life did not collapse in his absence. It simply continued. That continuity was not accidental. It was the result of decades spent refusing to build anything that depended on constant intervention. Everything he made could be understood, repaired, and sustained without him. That was intentional. Dependence, he believed, was the only true vulnerability. Years passed. The canyon absorbed his absence the way it absorbed everything else, slowly, evenly, without distinction. Stories condensed, details softened. What remained was not personality, but principle. People who came seeking inspiration often left unsettled. The place did not encourage aspiration. It encouraged responsibility. It did not ask what one wanted. It asked what one was willing to maintain. That question followed many of them home. Some ignored it. Others answered in small ways. Fewer answered it fully. None of that mattered to the canyon. It continued to offer the same lesson without insisting it be learned. Stone held heat. Water followed gravity. Time moved forward without concern for meaning, and somewhere within that movement, the quiet evidence of a life lived without excess or evasion remained, not preserved, not frozen, but integrated. Not a monument, a pattern, one that did not require repetition to be valid, only recognition. As seasons accumulated, the canyon developed a memory that did not belong to any single year. Spring did not arrive as an event, but as a gradual loosening. Ice retreated from shaded stone. Soil released its grip on seeds. The river rose and fell without urgency, tracing the same boundaries it always had. Those who returned year after year noticed that the place did not feel older. It felt settled. Age usually announces itself through decay or through replacement. Here, neither dominated. Materials wore down only where they were meant to. Repairs blended into original work so completely that it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. The distinction stopped mattering. This was not preservation in the museum sense. Nothing was frozen. Everything was allowed to age, but not to fail. That balance was rare. People accustomed to modern systems often asked when things would need to be redone entirely, when the walls would need replacing, when the tools would finally wear out. The answer was always the same. They would not. Not because they were indestructible, but because they had been built to be understood. Any part could be repaired without dismantling the whole. Any failure would be local, contained, instructive. Caleb had believed that opacity was danger. Anything you could not see into, you could not trust. Anything you could not repair yourself would eventually own you. That belief shaped every decision he made, whether he named it or not. It showed in the way fasteners were avoided unless necessary, in the way materials were chosen not for strength alone, but for predictability, in the refusal to hide complexity behind smooth surfaces. Everything here told the truth about how it worked. Visitors sometimes found that uncomfortable. They were used to surfaces that concealed labor, to convenience that erased effort. Here, effort was visible everywhere, not as decoration, but as record. The marks on handles, the uneven wear on steps, the slight asymmetry where stone met stone. Nothing pretended to be effortless. Over time, people who stayed long enough began to change how they moved. They lifted more carefully. They set things down instead of dropping them. They learned to pause before acting, not out of caution, but out of awareness. The place did not demand respect. It elicited it. Caleb's absence was felt most strongly in the mornings, not because something was missing, but because nothing was waiting. No expectation pressed down on the day. Tasks existed, but none insisted on immediacy. This absence of urgency was unfamiliar to many. Modern life trained people to respond rather than observe, to prioritize speed over accuracy, to resolve discomfort by escalation. Here, escalation was rarely rewarded. If something resisted, it was usually because it was not yet time. If a solution did not hold, it was because it had been rushed. If a task felt exhausting, it was often because it had been taken on too early or too late in the day. The canyon did not forgive impatience, but it also did not punish ignorance harshly. Mistakes were allowed. They simply carried consequences proportional to their nature. That proportionality was another lesson many did not expect. Failure here was not catastrophic unless compounded. Small errors stayed small if addressed honestly. Large problems emerged only when small ones were ignored repeatedly. Caleb had lived within that logic for decades. It had shaped his temperament more than isolation ever could have. He had become calm not because he avoided difficulty, but because he understood its scale. That understanding lingered in the space he left behind. People sometimes asked whether he had been lonely. Those who asked rarely stayed long enough to see the answer. Loneliness did not arise from absence here. It arose from misalignment, when effort and purpose diverged. When time was filled without meaning, Caleb had never allowed that divergence. His days were not full, but they were complete. Each contained what was necessary and no more. When something was finished, it ended. When something needed attention, it received it. Nothing spilled over into everything else. That containment was another quiet discipline. As years continued to pass, fewer people came with questions. More came with silence. They walked the paths without hurry. They sat near the river without checking the time. They left without needing to explain what they had found. The canyon did not ask them to remember details, only orientation, to know somewhere beneath habit and distraction that another way of arranging a life had existed, that it had not relied on novelty or accumulation, that it had been built slowly, deliberately, with full acceptance of its limits. That knowledge did not require adoption to be meaningful. It only needed to exist. Stone endured, water moved, time continued without emphasis, and within that continuity, the shape of a life lived without pretense remained, not as instruction, not as ideal, but as evidence. Evidence that sufficiency could be enough. Evidence that responsibility could be chosen rather than imposed. Evidence that a person could live without outrunning the day and still leave behind something that held. The canyon kept no record of this. It did not need to. The work spoke quietly, and it spoke still. Eventually, even the idea of completion became unnecessary. The canyon did not distinguish between what was finished and what was ongoing. It held both with the same indifference. Walls did not know they were walls. Tools did not know they had been tools. The river did not know it had carried a life alongside it for nearly half a century. Only people insisted on endings. Those who came later, standing where Caleb once stood, sometimes searched for a final message, a conclusion, some last trace of intention that would explain everything, justify everything, or resolve the discomfort that lingered after leaving. They did not find one. There was no single object that explained the whole, no sentence carved into stone, no moment that could be pointed to and named as the meaning. What existed instead was coherence, the rare alignment of effort, place, and time. Caleb had not lived toward a climax. He had lived toward consistency, day after day arranged so that none contradicted the last. A life that did not need to be summed up because it had never been fragmented. That was why nothing dramatic happened when it ended. The river flowed the next morning. Light reached the stone walls the same way it always had. Wind moved through the canyon without adjusting its path. Nothing noticed his absence except people, and even they noticed it less with each passing year. The caretakers continued their quiet stewardship, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. They knew that preservation was not about freezing time, it was about preventing interruption, about allowing systems to remain legible. They resisted improvement. They resisted optimization. They resisted the impulse to explain the place too much. Explanation had never been its strength. Presence had been. Some evenings, when the canyon darkened and the river lowered its voice, people still paused before leaving. They stood without speaking. They looked once more at the stone, the tools, the earth shaped patiently by human hands that had never asked to be remembered. And for a moment, they felt it. Not nostalgia, not inspiration, something quieter. Permission. The permission to live without excess explanation. The permission to build something slowly. The permission to choose responsibility without apology. Then they left. The canyon did not follow them. It remained where it was, doing what it had always done, holding heat, guiding water, erasing urgency, offering nothing and refusing nothing. Somewhere within that stillness, the pattern endured, not as a command, not as a standard, not as a dream to be copied, only as proof. Proof that a life, when shaped patiently and carried honestly, does not need to be loud to be complete. The river continued south. The stone stayed where it had settled. Time moved forward without concern for witnesses, and the quiet work of being enough went on, unchanged. Endurance was never about resisting change. That misunderstanding followed many people home. They imagined endurance as hardness, as refusal, as standing against time with clenched teeth. But nothing in the canyon supported that idea. Stone endured not because it fought weather, but because it accepted it. The river endured not by holding its shape, but by surrendering to motion. Caleb had understood that early, whether he named it or not. What lasted here was not the product of strength alone, but of compatibility. Each choice had been tested not against ideals, but against seasons. If something could survive winter without resentment, it was kept. If it demanded constant defense, it was abandoned. Endurance, in that sense, was not heroic. It was quiet agreement, an agreement between effort and reality, between intention and consequence, between what a person wanted and what a place would allow. Nothing here tried to outpace time. That was the mistake most lives made, treating time as something to defeat, compress, or escape. In the canyon, time was neither enemy nor ally. It was a condition, like gravity or cold. You worked within it or you failed. Caleb had worked within it. That was why the structures still stood, why the system still functioned, why the place did not collapse into memory when the man who built it disappeared. Endurance left traces, but not signatures. You could not point to a single moment where it was earned. It accumulated the way sediment does, grain by grain, unnoticed, irreversible. A life aligned long enough eventually became stable enough to remain. That was the final truth the canyon offered. Not that one must withdraw from the world, not that independence is purity, not that solitude is superior, only that what you choose to maintain will shape you in return. Caleb had chosen maintenance over expansion, coherence over speed, sufficiency over excess, and the result was not legend or ideology or instruction. It was endurance, a form of quiet persistence that did not argue for itself, did not demand admiration, and did not fade when attention moved elsewhere. The river still moved. The stone still held. The work still made sense. And somewhere between effort and acceptance, between labor and rest, the shape of a life that did not hurry remained, unbroken, unannounced, and complete. And perhaps that is where the story is meant to rest. Not with resolution, but with steadiness. Endurance does not announce itself at the moment it is achieved. It reveals itself only later, when nothing dramatic happens. When systems continue without supervision. When absence does not become collapse. When time passes and the shape of what was built remains legible. That is how you recognize it. Endurance is what stays after enthusiasm leaves, after witnesses go home, after explanations grow thin. It is what remains when effort is no longer new, when commitment has lost its shine, when the work is done not because it is inspiring, but because it is necessary. Caleb's life did not endure because it was extreme. It endured because it was consistent, because it asked the same questions every day and accepted the same answers without complaint. What is needed today? What can be sustained tomorrow? What should be left untouched? Those questions do not belong to wilderness alone. They belong to any life that hopes to last longer than its motivation. The canyon simply made them unavoidable. In the end, there was no triumph over nature here, no mastery, no conquest, only cooperation carried long enough to become stable, only effort repeated until it no longer felt heroic, only appropriate. That is the kind of endurance most people never see because it does not shine, it does not accelerate, it does not scale, but it holds. It holds heat through cold nights. It holds form through decades. It holds meaning without insisting on it. And when the hands that shaped it are gone, it does not mourn. It continues doing exactly what it was built to do. That may be the quietest definition of success available to a human life. Not to be remembered everywhere, not to be admired endlessly, but to leave behind something that still works. The river does not pause to acknowledge this. The stone does not soften in response. Time does not slow down to admire alignment. They simply continue. And in that continuation, in that refusal to dramatize what has already been proven, endurance finds its final form, not as resistance, but as balance, held long enough to become invisible.